Welcome to another episode of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we have a very special guest. Today we have Jack Symes. He's the producer of the popular The Panpsycast Philosophy Podcast and the editor of the Bloomsbury series, talking about philosophy. He is currently teacher and researcher of philosophy at the University of Liverpool in the UK. And his new book is called Philosophers on Consciousness, talking about the mind, talking about philosophy, which features a number of prominent contributors, some of which we've had on the show before, like Keith Frankish and Massimo Pigliucci. But yes, I want to give a big warm welcome to Jack. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you very much. It's a very kind and generous introduction. Lovely to meet you, and you too as well, Leon. I didn't realize you'd had Massimo and Keith on the podcast before. They're both brilliant and lovely people, aren't they? I'll have to check them out once we're done here.
Oh, and they're going to be so excited to see this podcast because we're literally about to solve the mystery of consciousness in the next hour.
Okay.
So to begin, right? So what's so interesting is that, obviously there's so much contention and I mean, so much debate around what consciousness is, whether or not it should even be conceived of as a mystery. But the thing that I know Alan and I were talking about and the thing we picked up on is that, I mean, even though there are definitely significant differences, there are also some interesting similarities between what seems like the two major theories of materialism and I don't know what you would call it, maybe on the other end, let's sort of the Mysterian version of consciousness, right? So both in a sense kind of argue that it's an illusion, right? So the materialist will argue, well, it's an illusion produced by the brain through evolution, right? It's sort of a synthesis of information that allows us to survive because like we're able to navigate the kind of environment more easily when we're not just bombarded with information, right? Illusion number one. And then you have panpsychist idealism, which says, well, no, this is all sort of an illusion in the sense of Maya, right? The Hindu term, that we are all kind of just these manifestations of pure consciousness. And essentially in the kind of old Bill Hicks kind of saying, we're all one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively, right? So, I mean, do you think that it's kind of interesting that it's so contentious, even though there are such similarities between some of these views?
You're right into the heart of it there, aren't we, Leon? No messing around. Let's get into the heart of the matter. I suppose the first thing to say is that they differ radically on their starting points, right? So Keith's view and perhaps Massimo's view and the illusionist's view in general, they start from the world and work inwards. They say, I am, therefore I think. The world is clearly physical. How does this conscious thing fit in with physical science and the physical world as we know it? And then the panpsychists like Goff and Strawson and Miri Albahari, they start with what they consider to be the unshakable truth, the undoubtable thing that is the fact that they're conscious, the fact that they're the one thing they can't doubt is that they are mind, and then they build from there. So I think a lot of the debate stems from that point forwards, that what you take to be epistemically superior, what do you build your philosophy from? So it raises loads of questions for epistemology, and then it obviously flourishes in philosophy of mind. What are the similarities? So apologies, there were so many ideas there. Give me a quick sense of what the main similarity is.
So when we're talking about dualism, right, we obviously have a dichotomy between, kind of consciousness and matter, right? But it seems like from now, I mean, look, I can't say for sure, this is not sort of my area of expertise, but it does seem like the materialists are more so moving into the illusionist conception of consciousness, just meaning essentially that consciousness isn't exactly what we think it is. And I disagree that they deny it, by the way. I don't think that that's exactly what they're doing. As obviously we've had Keith Frankish on multiple times, and he's vehemently sort of asserted and explained to us why he's not denying consciousness, right? So you have one conception that says, well, consciousness is an illusion. And then you have the panpsychist idealism conception, which is pretty much Hinduist philosophy, kind of in a modern sense, right? Where, again, going back to this Bill Hicks idea of like, we're all one consciousness experiencing itself subjective, right? So in some sense, consciousness is an illusion because there's a division that we see kind of like, in the so-called material world, but these material kind of, separations or these material illusions are literally just like barriers created by, the world or the universal consciousness, right? These are sort of these emergent properties that don't really exist at the fundamental level. So that's what I see as the similarity between what I think are the two seemingly main views. I mean, I could be wrong.
Yeah. No, I think you're spot on there in the spirit of it. So the illusionists accept that boring old physicalism that just says these brain states correlate with these experiences isn't going to work. They need what is a radical view of consciousness, right? They say as you put, I don't think that the illusionists deny the existence of consciousness as well. Well, Keith would certainly be really unhappy if I said otherwise. But when Strawson says, yeah, you do deny what we typically think to be consciousness before we go out and engage in philosophy, I think Keith has to accept that. He says consciousness isn't what you think it is. We are, the vast majority of us, in the illusion of the Cartesian theatre. We think that there's this sort of duality there, as you described as dualism a moment ago. And that's something that they do deny. Keith does deny an inner world of qualities and phenomenal experiences which are somehow non-physical. He says they're a physical trick of the brain. But no, I agree with you. What illusionism and panpsychism, I think, can be commended for is the fact they recognize the force of the problem and they realize they need a big solution to it.
Yeah.
Well, right. So it's my understanding that the illusionists believe that somehow non-conscious matter comes together in order to produce consciousness, in the sense that it's like a sort of a radical emergence, right? And that what we take to be consciousness, this big mysterious thing, if we could call it that, he made Keith and Massimo believe that that's sort of it's not what we don't think that it's this grand, beautiful experience of the world. It might just be.
By the way, it's Keith and Dan. So Massimo has a totally different.
Well, Massimo has a sort of biological perspective, but he doesn't necessarily subscribe to panpsychism. Correct?
No, but he's definitely not an illusionist. FYI.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100. Oh my God, Massimo would be so against. If anybody ever quoted him as an illusionist, I think he'd be really angry.
Well, so
even worse, I think I described him as a boring old physicalist a moment ago.
You probably did.
Massimo, if you're watching, I take it back almost immediately. I wouldn't want to cause him friends. He's one of the nicest people in the world, Massimo Pigliucci.
Yeah.
Even you could have the silliest idea that's ever been held, and I wouldn't dare say it to him.
Well, then would you mind if maybe we did this instead to sort of, so how about, because I know you sort of jumped into it at the very beginning, but maybe for our audience, right? That they're hearing this maybe for the first time, right? Like the illusionist view. Could we maybe highlight what is the illusionist view, and then maybe we could get into the other one. Yeah.
Yeah. So in the book, Keith Frankish begins his chapter. So he writes an original essay for the book on Philosophers on Consciousness, in which he says, imagine you're walking down a high street and some old lady comes up to you with a box, and you give her a coin, you look inside the box, into the little peephole, and there's nothing in there. Then she says something kooky and clicks her fingers, and then you look inside the box again, and there's a beetle in there. Keith says you've got three possible explanations. Either one, something actually magic is happening, something non-physical. She's that wonderful. She's outside of what you thought the natural world was capable of or included. Second of all, you might have a scientific explanation for how the beetle came about to be in the box. Thirdly, you might think that it's just an illusion that beetle was in the box. So you might consider the panpsychists and the dualists to fit into that first category. They're those that say, yeah, there's this non-physical special property which you didn't think was there, but it actually is. Physical science can't capture it. You've then got the scientific view, which would say, no, you could capture it in the form of an equation. You can explain that subjective seemingness in purely physical, with purely physical properties, just by studying the brain more. And I think Massimo would favor like an evolutionary neuroscientific view like that. Thirdly, you might think that it's just an illusion. Like you could just explain why it is you think there's a beetle in the box, how it is that the illusion comes about, including the thing that you say when you go, wow, like explaining this is really difficult. Well, this seems like a big problem. So very quickly, the reasons you might reject those views is that, let's just take the dualist first of all for the first option. It's really difficult to see how non-physical souls or minds can interact with physical brains, say the critic. Also, you've got the problem of mapping them out. It seems like we've got a purely physical explanation of the brain. As Philip Goff points out, you'd expect when you scan a brain for all this weird and wacky stuff to be going on, lighting up in all kinds of different areas without physical explanations, but that doesn't seem to be the case. Second of all, it doesn't seem like you can capture the feeling of fearing to get on a flight, the pain in your feet after you've been up dancing all night long, or the heavy hangover that you feel on a Sunday morning. You can't capture those feelings in equations. It doesn't feel like science can explain that phenomenal, seemingly phenomenal aspect. And then finally, the illusionist, right, is just saying, well, there's just a trick at play here. It's just nothing more than a physical trick of the brain. Yes, you see the beetle. Yes, you taste Marmite. Yes, your headaches, but it's not what you think it is. You're being misled. So I think that perhaps gives us a bit of color to attach these colorful theories to.
And why do panpsychists sort of reject that? Not every panpsychist is terribly rejecting it, right? Like Philip Goff actually doesn't necessarily have a problem with illusionism in the sense that he calls it a simple, elegant solution. But why would most panpsychists have a problem with that sort of conception of consciousness?
I like how you give that quote from Philip Goff, who does think it is a simple, elegant solution. He obviously gets on with Keith very well, and he's quite open-minded when it comes to it. People like Strawson, and Strawson's probably the person we're alluding to here. Galen Strawson said that illusionism is the silliest idea anyone's ever held. At least there's some counterexamples, like people say that nothing exists, people say that everything's subjective, but he thinks that it's the most silly claim someone's made, at least by an accredited theorist who wasn't drunk or stoned or something like that. So why does he think that? Well, because that conscious experience, as we mentioned a moment ago, to go back to Descartes, I can doubt everything that's in all of my senses. What I can't doubt is the fact I'm a thinking thing. The one unshakable truth is that I am a conscious mind, and I have this inner access to this world, which is undeniable, and I should build up from there. So if you were to deny that one unshakable truth, that might seem to some to be the silliest thing that one can do. Like to deny the fact that you are conscious, and that's you just being misled into thinking that you are. Does that answer your question there, Alan?
No, of course, because I think it's important to sort of distill the differences in these different conceptions of consciousness, at least for the audience. Of course, I do like that we jumped in right away, trying to already put panpsychists versus, materialists. But no, this is more of just to sort of talk it through, to sort of distill it.
Yeah, no,
but
I hear you. But then hold on. So isn't it a little bit then absurd to say that, okay, it's the illusionists who deny consciousness in the way we see it? Because it's not just the illusionists. In some way, the panpsychists do the same exact thing, right? Because again, if there's an emergent consciousness of some sort, right, from, again, this universal consciousness that none of us can really sense outside of this perceivable, maybe not even perceivable, this sort of thought experiment that we think about in the cognoscensory chamber, right, which I hope we get into. Right. So, but if that's the point, right, aren't we to say that in some sense the panpsychists are also arguing for a form of illusionism as well? They're pretty much saying that, yeah, I mean, it's really just one universal consciousness, but in some way it's somehow divided itself, and it's chosen. And again, I don't know how, this is a really difficult thing for me to even grasp, that there's this universal consciousness. And of course, it doesn't seem like this is Philip Goff's, just to be fair, his perspective. But it's like this consciousness somehow kind of sort of, what's the word? It gave birth to these other multiple forms of consciousness. But again, really fundamentally, right, it's all Brahman, right? It's all sort of this Hindu kind of ultimate reality, that essentially this is all kind of an illusion. So it's sort of interesting to me that, you have a beef with the illusionists, but yet in some way you guys are arguing for a form of illusionism yourself, even if, let's say, it's more of a material illusionism, more on the panpsychist side, if it's more of a material form of an illusionism, because let's say it's these tiny bits of atoms which are conscious, and they're somehow combining to form, broader forms of conscious, but that's still kind of an illusion, is it not? Because this is still a fundamental reality that we don't see in the everyday world. And you could even argue that because we don't perceive this fundamental reality, the reality that we are getting is actually then an illusion, because I don't see Alan as a bunch of atoms in combination to create Alan.
That's the way to look at it.
Right. Alan is just atoms. He's atoms, aka Alan.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. There's loads of interesting ideas. That the first thing I want to pull up on is that, so the book Philosophers on Consciousness involves, it starts off with, what's the nature of conscious experience? What is it like to be someone? What's the problem here? Then we get into Massimo's view and Pat Churchland's view, where they try and deflate the problem. No, it's not as big of a problem as we think it is. The question of how the brain can produce subjective experience. Then we get onto the illusionists, Frankish and Dennett. And then we move into panpsychism. That's what we're doing here, right? So we go Strawson, Goff, Miri, Albahari. And I co-write that final chapter with Miri Albahari. And so when you say, you guys are like are pretty upset with the illusionists, aren't you doing a similar thing? Aren't you denying the existence of perhaps the brain, right? By saying that it's all just mental stuff. The first thing to say on that is that I'm not wedded to any particular view in philosophy of mind, apart from boring old physicalism. I'm quite happy, and I consider myself philosophically homeless on the topic, and more of a guide to it rather than like someone saying here's the correct view. So the final chapter is very much here's this big idea to be provocative and go away and think about and bring us towards the end of that journey. With that said, I do think it's an elegant and promising solution to the problem of consciousness. So I'm happy to take the question. The panpsychists, as you rightly point out, Leon, the materialist panpsychists like Strawson and Goff, they don't deny the existence of physical brains. You might be a micropsychist or a cosmopsychist. So first of all, panpsychism says that consciousness is a fundamental and ubiquitous feature of the cosmos. It's everywhere. And you can take that two ways. You can have a big cosmic mind and it breaks down into little minds, or you can start from the ground up and you can have like this fundamental, primitive, rudimentary type of consciousness, a part of every fundamental physical thing in the world. And when they come together in the right way, brain-wise, they produce like macro unified conscious experiences. So I think the likes of Goff and Strawson can eat their cake and have it too when it comes to deny, like they don't deny the brain, they don't deny consciousness. So if you're worried about denying one, I don't think that can be levered against either of them. However, yeah, like the final chapter focuses on a form of idealist panpsychism. And as you say, for the Hindus, everything is Brahman. Like everything is this one unified conscious mind. And there is no physical stuff. There's no material stuff. It's all just more mind stuff. So the whole world is comprised of just fundamental consciousness, ideas, and perspectives within that ocean of consciousness. So yeah, that's very Eastern. The likes of Schopenhauer, the likes of Berkeley would embrace it. You know, there's almost 2 billion Hindus and Buddhists and Taoists, etc., on the earth who would wholeheartedly embrace this view. But to answer your question, yeah, like if you're an idealist panpsychist, you deny the existence of physical brains. Like they are there, but they're not what you think they are. So the same way as what the illusionists would say. I don't think, to be honest, calling anyone's views this, like Chalmers said is in his chapter, calling people's views the silliest claim that's ever been made isn't going to get us very far, but it certainly makes for a good read and interesting debate.
Yeah.
Well, I by the way, I can totally go with the panpsychist idealist view in the sense that, I mean,
I'd love to hear that.
Phenomenologically speaking, right? let's even use that cognoscensory chamber, like a deprivation chamber, right? If you are not stripped of all the senses, but say you're so in tune, so in the moment that conceptions fall away, it's just literally just the experience of being conscious, right? Then the things that sort of, this is very hard to sort of parse, by the way, but what I'm trying to say is, like, it seems that this is something Sartre has said and other people, like that existence, that being sort of precedes essence, right? That you are conscious before you are this or that. Before I am Alan, I just am, right? And I'm having this sort of experience of the world, and everything that appears in the world is appearing within consciousness.
Right.
So in the sense that my relationship, my interdependent relationship with the world is a relationship of mind interaction. Like it's made up of mind stuff, like in that last chapter there. So it doesn't seem like it's definitely seems very reasonable to say that the world is made up of mind stuff and there is no relationship. There's no relationship that doesn't exist that doesn't involve a mind internally and in a sense externally, right, in terms of how you experience that relationship with the world. Now, I know there's something that you mentioned in that last chapter where does the world go? Like, how does an apple maintain its appliness when nobody is there to see it. So that part I have a little bit of trouble parsing with the explanation that sort of follows from there, in terms of the universe being conscious and maintaining the characteristics of the apple. I'm not sure I quite understand that part so well, but it definitely does make sense that there is some sort of relationship between mind and the world. Always, it's always that kind of relationship, right?
Well, can I flip that on its head?
Please, yeah, that's great.
Okay, so what we know, right? So about babies, right? So babies technically, from kind of what psychology, developmental psychology and neuroscience tells us is that babies don't perceive a difference between like them and the rest of the world, right? So pretty much with the kind of an infant brain, right? Probably even a toddler brain too, there's a sort of connection that they feel like with the rest of the world around them, right? However, on the other side, right, we know that there's a distinction, right? So when we see a baby, we don't say, oh, that's me. We say that's a baby, right? So, and we would say because their brains aren't fully developed yet, they don't have the sense perception, or I guess the cognitive perception concepts of you and I, right? So the way that we do, they kind of see the world all as one. And like when the person is hallucinating, right, they may have a psychedelic experience where they see the world as one and they're like, oh my God, like, there's no ego, right? Ego dissolution, right? We would say the default mode network is off, right? However, the observer would say, no, this person is just hallucinating. And no, that's just the baby. That baby's brain hasn't developed yet to develop the concept of you and I. It only sees the world as one, right? So can we say that maybe it's possible that the baby and the person hallucinating are actually just misperceiving or misunderstanding reality?
You can say that,
right?
But it's sort of when you start to make distinctions and separate this and that, that's sort of a feature of us just trying to sort of make sense of the world. But if you if you sort of break down how does experience sort of begin, like with even you just waking up, or just before you even say anything or create anything or think anything, there's a sort of so-called space from which that stuff arises, even that determination that this is a baby and this is somebody having a hallucinatory experience. So it's tough for me to sort of talk this through, but I don't know. What do you think, Jack?
Yeah, there's loads of stuff there. I suppose the best place to start is to pick up where we sort of left off a moment ago, which is that for Descartes, right, he opens up the mind-body problem when he says, I'm this mind and there's that physical world outside of me, and there's a gap there. And then the physicalists get worried. They're like, well, how do we bring these together? And the panpsychists say we can bring it together like this, where rather than following Descartes, we could follow Bishop Berkeley, and say, well, there's no physical stuff at all. Let's not open up the gap to begin with. And let's just say that rather than there being a physical world, it's just ideas, we said a moment ago. So for Descartes, how do I know that I'm not being deceived? How do I know that the apple is not going to turn to an orange when I walk out of the room? Ontological argument. Everything's great for God, like great for us if God exists. God's good. God would never systematically deceive us. He wouldn't keep tricking us. That's not what a good God would do. Well, Berkeley says, well, we can get rid of the mind-body problem, and instead we can say that God just holds the ideas in place instead. Now, that might not be palatable for everybody. So what Miri Albahari suggests is that we replace God with this ocean of consciousness, this perspectiveless consciousness, which is alive to itself. And it's a very, very Hindu idea. And I like how you bring up the cognitive-sensory deprivation tank or chamber, in which it's very similar to a meditative experience that one might have, in which they realize that like everything is one. Like we all met that person with that white guy with dreadlocks, didn't we, as undergraduates or something? It was just like, fortunately, we never had to bump into them again, but maybe he was onto something. The point being is that everything is made up of consciousness, and it's perspectiveless. So when you take away all of my cognitive experiences and all of my sensory experiences, the tank says, well, once you've stepped into the tank and it's stripped all those things away, the thought experiment says, you're still left with this empty consciousness. Like the consciousness is still there, So you can make sense of consciousness being that, without consciousness, without contents. You might disagree with that point, and it's not a hill which, again, I want to die on, but I can see why someone might be skeptical of it. Now, the question then, which you started with, Alan, is how then can this ocean of consciousness make sure the oranges don't turn into apples, the apples turn into oranges when you leave the room? Well, this conscious field sees, right, in some sense, this apple or orange. It's watching it. So rather than God watching it, you've simply got this underlying conscious world looking at the apple, watching the apple and the orange all the time. So it doesn't change. It's always alive in the mind of some conscious thing. So it holds them in place. It's alive to itself. I'm not sure. Again, you might not think that sounds like too technically put, but hopefully that gets the idea across.
Yeah, here's so the great conception of it. But here's the question that I would have, right? So if the consciousness emerges from the single consciousness, or let's say the hypothesis, well, the consciousness, and somehow, first of all, there's no reason behind it, which is kind of difficult, right? So there's no reason behind why this one consciousness would want to manifest these multitude of singular consciousnesses. I guess consciousness, I don't know how you would even say that, but multitudes of consciousness, right? But okay, but that's number one. And number two is also, why do brains then develop, right? So why do babies start out feeling like they're enmeshed with the world? Again, like, they're part of some single unity here, that there is, again, distinction between you and I, but then they develop these distinctions and they start to see themselves, as individuals, right? So is it more so likely that, okay, well, it's because the brain it develops, right, has a deeper and more complicated understanding of the world, where it doesn't just see unity, where now it sees distinctions? Or is it more likely that somehow, as this consciousness emerges, other consciousness, they're somehow like developing further and further individuation? And then again, the question is why, if that's the case.
Cool. Okay. Not an easy question again, but
right.
I'll have a stab at it. So I'm quite a big fan of Schopenhauer and Bernardo Kastrup's work and reading of Schopenhauer. So I think that's a good way in of thinking about one possible solution to that question. So for Schopenhauer, we've got this underlying world of consciousness, this big mind I spoke about a moment ago, and he describes that as the will. And the will for Schopenhauer is blindly striving to see itself. So why does it manifest itself in some way? Well, they're all attempts at blindly getting to be conscious of something, to see something. Now, that doesn't have any rhyme or reason. It's just trying to do it. That's the brute fact about the world. I think any metaphysics is going to have that why question, and all of them are going to open up a PhD thesis and more on each one. So perhaps we can't go down there. But here's the answer, that it's blindly striving to see itself. And why do minds then come about, like perspectives, yours, mine, and Alan's? Why are we all like seeing the world? Well, we're manifestations of this conscious will, and in some experiences we get to look at the will itself. We become alive to it, and that's just a product of what it's trying to do. I mean, you might think that sounds too kooky and wacky, and I don't pretend that that this view is without its problems for any moment. But in terms, you're asking here for an explanation, not just of how consciousness fits into the world, but you're asking also, like, why is there a world to begin with, and why does it work like this? And I mean, that's above my pay grade, to be honest, Leon. You need to ask someone who's who's more qualified on such questions.
No, that's fair. But couldn't we just combine our explanations that we derive from, our study of biology and the panpsychist?
Oh no! Can I tell you why? So when we
actually, could I just build?
Yeah, sure. Do you think? I'm ready.
So, for example, when you asked that question, you know what answer came to my mind? Not that I'm qualified at all, but
sure.
I would say that I was thinking, okay, well, that's a feature of survival, right? That we become individuals, and that in order to survive, it's very good for for us to have a sort of individualist sort of perspective, that we need to separate this and that. Or just in general, just being well, how should I put this? I just feel like it's an aspect of survival for us to sort of develop these individual sort of personalities or character, but maybe that's not a complete view. But fine. Go into what you were saying. It's very hard to parse these ideas
Okay,
out.
so
Yeah.
when we're talking about brain development in terms of evolution, right, there is a rhyme and reason, right? So even though there's no sort of God willing it to happen, right, the understanding is the reason why the human brain kind of develops in the way it does was number one, right? So there's a kind of lineage, right? So we can call this a little bit of, I guess, recapitulation, right? Where sort of there was a time where sort of animals, mammals, whatever, they kind of evolved brains in their own kind of distinct ways because obviously they help them survive, they help them reproduce, right? And now the argument here as well, the reason why it takes brains so long to develop, right, in a sense, is because it's sort of like a birth and child development is like microevolution because it follows the blueprint of macroevolution, right? Which makes a lot of sense, right? Again, it's
reasonable. It's
right. It's ways for
yeah.
the organism to survive, right? And the organism is pretty much a copycat, right? It sort of copies what comes before it. But again, when we talk about this world consciousness, there's really not a reason for it. I still don't understand why this universal consciousness would manifest these multitudes of minds and, minds in different, first of all, I don't even really know what a bird mind can do for this universal consciousness. Let's say that. So why would it manifest these minds? What's the reason for it?
Well, okay. So I have a few, and by the way, of course, we should let Jack respond here, but here's my conception of it, of course, which is just that we're a type of being that likes to ask why and what's the reason for this, and what's the purpose for this in terms of our understanding of the goings on of
I'm sorry, because I need to just let me be clear about this. So when I say why, I actually technically mean how. That's actually my fault. So there is no why to evolution, right? Because there's no purpose to it per se, right? When we look at how, we find the reasons and the kind of causes, right?
That's right. Well, so back to what I wanted to say before, then couldn't we just use these working theories, like in terms of biology, right, and physical science? It's done us quite well, right? It's very reliable in terms of the discoveries that we've made, the technology that's come from it, right? I still would say that it's incredibly reasonable to say that the world is made up of mind stuff and that your entire interaction of the world involves mind, right? But in terms of that aspect of it, I'm just trying to sort of
and I'm only smiling because if I start getting into this hole with him, you're not going to be able to talk anymore, so I'm not going to
talk. Right, I will cease speaking. I'm sorry, Jack, go ahead. It's hard for me to Yeah.
So I think it's an important question to ask, but I suppose there's lots of stories you could tell about why it happens in terms of you could just say, well, it's exactly the same as what you thought was the physicalist account, but what you think is physical just doesn't turn out to be physical. And I don't see what the major problems would be there. You could be a Hindu, like they've got a worldview which is all connected together and has its big narrative and story, and all the whys are flicked off at the end, all the I's are dotted at the top. So you could tell a Hindu story about why it is that the world exists on this big plane of consciousness. You might be a pantheist. You might think that God is omnipresent and that he is a person with a conscious mind. So there are lots of stories you could tell in terms of how that plays out on a wider metaphysical scale. But the conversation about evolution, I think, is a more interesting one that perhaps listeners who aren't particularly blown away by the prospect of idealist panpsychism, they might say, yeah, consciousness is just something that evolves to help us survive. I think one interesting way in here is what Susan Blackmore talks about in the second chapter of the book, where I think she borrows this from David Chalmers from his book, The Conscious Mind, where you can imagine these creatures in our evolutionary past, let's say 150, 200,000 years ago, where we had some human beings who are conscious, normal humans like us three, who all have presumably conscious minds. And then you've got zombies, these imitation men, these things that are exactly like us, but don't have an inner world of experience. And Blackmore says, well, you might think, right, that evolution would have a reason for favoring the conscious over the zombies, but that doesn't seem obvious to her. She thinks because their behavior and everything they do is completely the same, physically indistinguishable, that the conscious have no evolutionary advantage over the zombies. So I think that's a good way to start thinking about it. Now, people like David Chalmers say it, perhaps it collapses wave functions. Evolution's not going to do all of the work for us. People like Pat Churchland say it might be important for developing language. Massimo says, well, it helps us run mental simulations of possible outcomes, and that seems like it will be evolutionarily beneficial. I think that latter one's probably my favorite out of all three. I can see how that might play out. So, yeah, but that still doesn't answer the question, though. Even if you identify why it benefits us evolutionarily, then you still need some kind of explanation for how that, we've got the why there. Why is it there? But how is it that soggy gray matter gives rise to vivid technicolor and experience? Why does it feel like anything? It's like trying to get ethics from rhubarb, right? It says on sale. So you need something, say, people like Galen Strawson to start working with. He runs the argument against itself and says, just as to develop an eye or a brain or a nose, you need some kind of physical matter to get started with. You need some building blocks. So too, you need that for conscious minds. So there must be some kind of rudimentary consciousness at the foundation of our ontology to make sense of how these minds could come about in the first place.
Yeah. So
no, go for. I was going to mention strong emergence and weak emergence, but
okay, because I'm going to go a little bit deeper right now. Okay. So I'm going to invoke Occam's razor here, and I'm also going to invoke a book by. So he was in. I'm going to invoke the book. It's called Reincarnation by Manly Palmer Hall. So I know a lot of people don't know who he was. He was like, I guess if you're into like conspiracy stuff and occult stuff, he's probably one of the most famous like Freemasons to have ever lived. Right? He wrote God knows how many books. So he wrote this really great book on reincarnation, like a million years ago, probably I think in the 40s. It's called like Reincarnation, like Cycle of Rebirth or something along those lines, right? So so it's a brilliant book, by the way. So this book is absolutely, so Manly Palmer Hall is a complete autodidact, never went to school, grew up in the slums of Canada, God knows where, found his way into the US, literally became a Freemason, became a popular writer, kind of the works, just really crazy story. So Manly Palmer Hall wrote this book on reincarnation as a way to kind of explain what the Hindu version / Freemasonic version of reincarnation is, right? So, and this is why I'm invoking Occam's razor, right? So Manly Palmer Hall, as brilliant as he was, had an incredibly complex understanding of the world, right? So this is from my vague memory of the book. It's obviously not going to be precise, but I'm going to do my best. Mm-hmm. So he pretty much said that here's this world consciousness, right? Again, we're going back to psychic idealism. So here's this world consciousness, and the consciousness tries to learn about itself, like through these multitudes of consciousness, right? To you, me, Jack, whomever, right? So, but the point is, he says there's no actual afterlife, right? So he says, don't be an egoist, right? Don't believe that your soul survives death, right? He says there's a distinction between the soul and the spirit. So the spirit is actually this universal consciousness, which is when it's done with you, it's done with you, right? And the soul actually dies. So Manly Palmer Hall says, like, even though there's this fundamental underlying consciousness, right? It's sort of like it's using you to learn more about itself and to kind of manifest these deeper parts of itself that it couldn't have known otherwise, right? But however, once you die, once the soul and the brain is extinguished, you are gone forever, right? You go back into the kind of ultimate reality, into the Brahman, right? So here's why I think Occam's razor is pertinent, right? Can't we just say that people just die, that there is no fundamental underlying spirit that's using any of us for anything, that literally we are born and then we die and then that's it? Because what he's saying is that the evidence is pretty much the same, right? The evidence is, yes, the evidence says that your body dies and you are absolutely right. That's exactly what happens, but it's also a little bit deeper because some sort of energy that you can't see, it goes back into the spirit, yada, yada, yada. Very complicated, right? So somehow or other, you go back into the spirit learns from you, it takes this information, then it manifests further spirit, right? Very complicated, right? But really, if we're just dying anyway, can't we just say that there is no fundamental spirit and we probably just die?
You can say it, but you don't know it.
No, but that's what I'm saying. Occam's razor, right?
Sure.
Occam's razor says the evidence, right? These are both very explanatory positions, right? Both of them, right? Both of them explain the same evidence. And the evidence, let's say, is you and I die, right? We can see it, we can feel it, we can even smell it, right? We see death in front of us. However, in Manly Palmer Hall's complicated understanding is the death it's really a death. However, some part of you, some energy or whatever goes back into the world consciousness. Again, it's using.
Yeah, we don't know if that's true.
No, but what I'm saying, but why I'm saying is this is like the rule of thumb, right? I would invoke Occam's razor and I would say he's overcomplicating the matter, because I think we could just probably say, here's the evidence that this thing dies and it probably just dies and there's nothing else deeper than that, right? That's what I'm saying. I don't know. What do you think, Jack?
Yeah, I think it's quite close to a Schopenhauerian view, which we were talking about a moment ago, first of all. But then you've added this extra layer, which is a type of afterlife. Now, if you were a Hindu of this type, you'd probably be a panentheist. The panentheist holds that let's, in this case, the way we're describing it is that the world is all conscious, and then there's this extra layer which isn't a part of what we consider to be the world, which is in this sense Brahman, which when we die, our Atman, i.e. soul, will become a part of Brahman, unify with Brahman once again. If we live the kind of life which the Hindu wants us to, then we won't be reincarnated. Right? We could say a million things about that, right? And the problems or the benefits of such a view. The idealist panpsychist, as described in the book, obviously doesn't have to embrace that. They can just say, as you say there, Leon, yeah, we just die. And maybe that is simpler for them than telling a tale of what happens once these perspectives die, like once these perspectives burn out, right? As perhaps the Buddhists might describe it. So I don't think it's a problem necessarily for solving the hard problem of consciousness. But then again, when you're invoking Occam's razor in this way, maybe you wield it a little bit too readily and cut yourself in doing so, because what we want to ask first of all is, what is it to be a conscious being? So when you ask that question, if you end up believing something kooky like a non-physical soul, like nearly 90% of the planet do, then you've got a good reason for thinking that that thing cannot be destroyed. It goes back to Socrates and Plato and the tale of the cloak maker and the cloak wearer, right? It doesn't seem like the soul is the kind of thing that can be destroyed or decay in the same way that physical stuff does. And so if it can't decay and it can't be destroyed like that, if it's non-physical after all, if it's eternal, then where does it go? So I suppose, first of all, we need to answer the question of what it is to be conscious and what constitutes consciousness. And then we can say, well, would it be simpler not to tell a story and just say these kind of things just wander around, or like maybe they die with the body. It's maybe they can't survive without being attached to a brain, and it's a kind of weird energy. I suppose, yeah, to answer the question shortly, it depends on what you think consciousness is.
Mm-hmm. I'm just, is this okay? Can you say more about that? Because I'm not sure I get it.
So if your question is, wouldn't it be simpler just to say that when we die, we die?
Right. Mm-hmm.
And I say, yeah, but you haven't told me what consciousness is yet.
Okay.
So if you think consciousness is a soul, then you need to tell me what happens to the soul after the body dies.
Gotcha.
If you think that consciousness is just a physical trick of the brain, then yeah, once the brain decays, there is no illusion of consciousness. So it depends on what our theory is about what consciousness is, first of all. And the overwhelming majority of people on the planet do think that the soul or an Atman or something like that does exist. So they do owe us some kind of story. Now, so Occam's razor I don't see as coming in there. Maybe the story could be less extravagant and much simpler and much more reasonable, and Occam's razor can come in there. But yeah, in short, does that answer your question now, that it depends on what we think consciousness is?
Yeah. No, we'll go ahead. You were going to say something?
Well, one thing I really loved in the book is sort of Philip Goff's sort of the way he outlined Galileo's error, right? And so I won't explain as I guess I'll ask you to explain it probably in a moment or so. But one thing that I found interesting is that he said that physical science, although it's led to so many great things in terms of the technology that it spawned and advances for us, that there may be another kind of science out there that we're not quite aware of, that may lead to a better understanding of consciousness, a sort of non-physical science, not in the sense of a social science, but maybe even something I cannot even conceive of.
No one can.
Right, right. So is it possible you could speak a little bit on that? Maybe I'm not explaining it perfectly.
Yeah, so I'll give it a go. I'm a big fan of Goff's work myself, and I think he does do a great job of just setting up the problem, first of all, right? When Aristotle was kicking about and everyone was following his metaphysics, the redness was actually on the surface of the tomato, the spiciness was actually in the paprika, to borrow Goff's example. And then Galileo strips the world of all these properties and leaves us with the purely mathematical objective ones, these primary qualities or properties. So science now is in the language of mathematics, and as he rightly points out, you can't capture like the taste and the color of those things in the form of equations. They're different kinds of things. And so what he then says is, well, science itself just explains what things do and not what they are. What's the inner essence and nature of these things? And he says, well, we've got this thing called consciousness. We don't know where to put it. And we have this hole within our theory of the ground theory of the world. And we can plug that hole, we can color it in with consciousness, and it will fit together. The question you're asking is, what would a science of consciousness look like? And I think that's a really interesting question, because that runs through the book as well with Michelle Montague talking about autophenomenology. So she thinks just by reflecting on the nature of your experience, you can learn things about consciousness. So you can learn that there's something it's like to fear being on a flight or making 2 + 2 = 4. And that's different to just the sensory. And that is a type of science, right? If we do it systematically. Now, it's not going to look like the science which we're used to. It's not going to look like physical science in that it's not going to be able to be captured in these equations. But to use an example of like people who drink wine and love drinking wine or love like craft ale, they can give us pretty rich descriptions of these experiences. And so you might think that capturing this big phenomenological account of what the nature of consciousness is will involve loads of this descriptive work. But also people like Daniel Dennett, he's not very happy with autophenomenology. And so he gives us heterophenomenology, which sounds even worse, doesn't it? But he says, well, what you need to do is get people to report their accounts and then check objectively whether they can actually be experiencing that thing. Personally, I don't know what that looks like and how that plays out, but you can certainly see how information about what people think they're experiencing, correlating it to brain states, etc., could make progress with what the nature of consciousness is like. But it's not going to be, we're not going to be like testing souls in machines and plugging people into cognisensory deprivation tanks and things like that. It'll most likely be descriptions of people's inner worlds.
Interesting.
Yeah. And, I mean, just going into these thought experiments, what makes it so hard for me to kind of accept them as so to, take them too seriously or seemingly, or take them as something that's plausible. Like, I mean, look, cognitive sensory deprivation, right? I mean, look, again, unless you're on some sort of hallucinogen, that's probably not going to happen to you, or unless you're some sort of like expert level monk, I think maybe.
Yeah.
And even still, we can say we don't really even know what that is or what that feels like. And if really it is a stripping of consciousness or maybe something else, because most of us have never experienced it. And then on top of that, with the zombie experiment and Miri the scientist, right? Miri the neuroscientist, right? These are all like, I mean, they're clever examples, but they're also so far away removed from reality.
I would say one thing, Miri the scientist and the zombie example is 100%. I'm with you. The thing is, I feel like things along the lines of meditation or a deprivation chamber, or even hallucinogens, these are things that are actually, even if what you're postulating is most people don't have access to it or they're not experiencing.
But can I just say the interpretation on these hallucinations is that, like, yes, I felt like egolessness, right? But how do we know that that's what it actually is?
Fair, in a way. I mean, it depends. I guess you just have to work on your definitions of what ego is and egolessness is. But then, yeah, fair enough. I guess you wouldn't know if you're being egoless.
Yeah, because my thing is, I can't even envision that, like a consciousness stripped of everything.
Have you tried a sensory deprivation chamber before?
No.
So what all I'm saying is there are certain experiences that are accessible to us that will give credence to these reasonable conceptions, these other reasonable conceptions of consciousness. Not saying that it proves them, because I'm with Michelle Montague on the idea that yes, it's good to sort of have all these different working theories available and maybe assign a probability to them. That's actually cool. That's kind of how I like to do things too, in terms of like, I don't like to be married to any particular viewpoint, but I do like seeing through the lens of that viewpoint to see its use or effectiveness, or what effect that has for me. For instance, especially like at the end of the book, when you imagine what it would be like to be that everything is conscious. It's actually, so it's not quite easy to do.
Not even close.
No, but I'll say this. No, because when you're reading and you try to stop and do it, I actually in brief moments can sort of vacillate between that sort of experience and then me going back to reading the book, because it's not quite easy to maintain that sort of experience of the world, but you could actually. It's very interesting. What
I guess I would just want to know what that feels like.
Yeah.
Alan, were you saying at the start, though, you thought you agreed with Leon with saying that Mary, the neuroscientist, and zombies? Yeah, I'm with you there, Leon. Like, they're not useful. But then you went on to say that the cognisensory deprivation tank gives you at least a way of thinking about the problem. And on that criteria, like, it's really hard to do. It might be like, we're not going to be doing it, right? But the point is if the world is as you say it is, then maybe you've got this problem. So the zombie thought experiment, or the imitation man, and the Mary the neuroscientist, they simply ask, from the physical facts alone, can we deduce consciousness? Does Mary learn something new? Or if we took a physical person, does consciousness necessarily follow from those properties alone? And so, yeah, like they sound kooky, they sound wacky, and perhaps it's not great marketing for philosophers who want to be considered like doing hard science, and hence why perhaps they want to rally against it. But they certainly help us with getting people hooked and interested in the problem, or giving us some kind of apparatus to play with and explain to them, right?
Oh yeah, no, 100%. The reason why I started that with "I'm with you" is in the sense that I just sort of wanted to outline that at least that's like a sensory deprivation experience or meditation, apart from the thought experiment aspect of it, that is something that you could that is accessible to you. It's not necessarily this thing that most people may not have access to in order to.
But my point is that it's not accessible to you to that degree, right? Where you're completely stripped of everything but pure consciousness, whatever pure consciousness even is.
Here's another thing I would say to that, which is, are you saying that because in your conception you think you have to be a monk or a special person?
Oh, I'm honestly just being kind. I'm saying, okay, I'm leaving some openings for these possibilities. I actually don't even think that monks experience pure what is pure how do we even conceptualize pure consciousness?
How about this? Somebody who may have had that experience in human history
maybe
has pointed. No. Let me put it this way.
Okay.
I'm not saying that they had exactly what you would call pure consciousness.
Whatever.
I'm following you. I'm with you. Fair enough. But then there are people who have pointed to having experienced this sort of experience of egolessness. Do you think that is not accessible to you, that you have to be some kind of doing like a special person in order to experience that experience that they're pointing to? I know I said experience 5 times there,
right? But here's and I think, by the way, maybe it's even important to distinguish between, if there is a difference between pure consciousness and egolessness, right? So I wonder if it's actually the same thing. So again, going back into the conception of the default mode network, right? I guess I can see how maybe one person in some sort of a hallucinatory experience feels like they're connected to the entire world. Maybe, okay, but is that pure consciousness? Because you still have senses. I mean, you're still sensing that you're a part of the world.
Fair enough. But right. Okay, so it's fine. We don't have to call it pure consciousness, but let's just say that these people are pointing to an experience that is accessible to people. Is like, could you conceive that maybe the people who are having that experience that they call pure consciousness, whether it is or not,
right,
might come to conceive of like at least like panpsychist related views of the world?
You're asking if in my mind I could see that as support for the perspective?
No, that's why, not why, but that could be like one of the underpinnings for why somebody might conceive
100%.
Like there's a reasoning.
No,
like
100.
Like it's reasonable.
Oh, by the way, So just to be clear, I don't think the panpsychist perspective is absurd. It's not that I think it's silly or anything like that. Right. So just to be clear, it's not that I think it's absurd. It's just that my understanding of it just doesn't seem to fit with the evidence. That's it. So I mean, look, I guess you can conceive that as absurd. So I just want to be clear. So it's a brilliant view based on particular experiences that, yes, people have had over millennia. I do not discredit that, right? However, as the evidence, as we normally would see it on sober minds, it just doesn't fit with it from my conception of it.
What evidence are you thinking of there?
Well, so pretty much the material world, right? And experimentation. So my question is, how is that like, okay, I don't want to go back to this because I know he kind of said this and people gave him a little bit of shit on it. When Philip Goff was on the Joe Rogan podcast, Rogan kept asking him, like, how is a rock conscious, right? And this wasn't the question that Philip Goff could answer. So that's what I mean about the evidence, right? So if we're looking at the evidence, we're looking at this coffee cup, whatever else, right? This is all evidence for a material universe, right? The rock, right? The rock indicates in some way that the material universe is something that we're kind of enveloped in. But how would this be evidence for just pure consciousness? That I can't understand that.
So the first thing to say is that I appreciate, Alan, you waving the flag for the cognitive deprivation tank is something we should develop. I'm all for it as well. And maybe we can convince Leon if we manage to get one of these tanks and we strap him in. I think that's the only reason we moved on such a point, is that it's not like it's an extra bit of evidence, I suppose. I think you can both agree on this point, right? Leon says, I just can't imagine it. And you say, well, here's a helpful way to think about it. And you might think, well, that's not good enough for me, right? I still, that thought experiment isn't going to convince me that that's possible, but it's just an extra bit of evidence. Really, it's just saying, can you conceive of this being possible? Whereas the elegance or the persuasiveness of what we consider idealist panpsychism isn't that, oh, you have a mystical experience, turns out the world is just consciousness, there we go. It doesn't start from there. It starts off with, well, all of these other views can't explain consciousness. And if we want to close the mind-body gap, how about we don't get rid of mind like the illusionists do, but we get rid of body and we'll build up from there. So Leon, I haven't seen the Joe Rogan Goff interview, so I'm not sure exactly how that plays out, but I've mischaracterized Goff's view myself several times, and I think last time I mischaracterized it, he emailed me like, you're liable, like this is trouble, like stop doing this. And I was like, he was only kidding, of course, but I'm always hesitant to talk about it. But yeah, for Goff, like that's just not, it's not a subjective experience. It doesn't have the things necessary for being unified mind in the same way, like as rivers and things like that do. Plant life maybe, but it just doesn't fall into that category. It does like have like the individual physical, microphysical things at the most fundamental level. There is something it's like to be them, although so far alienated perhaps we can't conceptualize it. But there's no combination yet when it comes to rocks, perhaps is a good way of putting it. So yeah, I suppose the evidence which we're talking about here is just, well, we're trying to solve the problem. How do we avoid all the problems the other views face? Well, here's one possible solution. What problems does that face? Yeah, as you say, whether or not it's possible for the world just to be mind stuff. But I'm not sure, again, what this evidence looks like for, you say physical science shows us like rocks, and is it G. Moore who does the hand thing? He's like, where's the evidence for the physical world? It's like, well, look at my hand, right? That's kind of the example we wheel out for first years to be like, look how silly this guy is, right? We don't, that for Berkeley or for the Hindu, it's an illusion, right? In the same, like earlier on, Leon, you were saying, well, the illusionists, you were giving us a description of their view, and like I say, I see that as well as a promising solution to the problem. It's just not what you think it is, the mind. And so I think the idealist panpsychist can say something similar about what we think of as to be physical reality. Yes, it seems like there's a physical world, and I don't deny that you have an experience of what you think is the physical world, but actually in reality, it's not that.
Well, okay, so I'm going to push this a little bit further then, right? Because I actually subscribe to more of an illusionist perspective. So the reason why I would say that is because if we're looking at, okay, so let's say I do subscribe to some version of illusionism. I think that there's a high probability that based on what we know on evolution, that consciousness evolved to kind of simplify the world around us in order for us to survive, right? Simplify the information, the inputs, right? The inputs that we take in. So yeah, whatever, the informative inputs, whatever you want to call it. So, but then on top of that, right, what we know from, and obviously I'm nowhere near an expert expert in this, but what we know about, like, quantum mechanics, and what we know about, let's say, kind of what we see in terms of like how photons, hit the retina, and then we create an image in the visual cortex, and then obviously how sound waves are then essentially kind of converted into hearing, right? So why I think the illusionists are probably right is because you see from the experimental evidence, right, that there is a slightly, well, not even slightly, it seems like a completely different world out there than what we see in here, right? And that's obviously what Keith stated on our show. He pointed this out way more eloquently than I will. So the idea there is that essentially, atoms are kind of like mostly empty space, right? We kind of see the way that they sort of interact with one another. Seems like in some way they combine in our heads to create this image that, we see in front of us. And I would probably argue that, yes, that's because that's the way evolution shaped us, because it's going to be really hard for us to distinguish our kind of surroundings if all we're seeing are just a bunch of atoms. So, but again, it just seems like from what we're seeing from, from quantum mechanics and from the evidence on subatomic particles, is it's actually our brains that's interpreting what the outside world is giving us, right? But from the panpsychist view, the understanding is, well, there is no outside world, right? It's just pure consciousness. And again, I don't see what the evidence of that could be outside of, well, we can't explain it from a dualist perspective, and then the materialist can't tell us how, consciousness is formed. So therefore, this seems like the best case scenario or the best explanation possible. I just don't think that that's true, again, because there's this understanding here that, okay, there is a sort of realm of particles. And then we know that our brain, this is the thing that we can't explain, how our brain translates the information that we're getting from the outside world into the images, sights, sounds, etc. Right? That's the thing that we can't answer. But again, if you're looking at the evidence, and of course you can always say, well, that's just an illusion too. But then I'm like, okay, how many illusions do we have, right?
Yeah. Okay. So two things. First of all, again, to draw the distinction, you say panpsychists just say that there's only mind stuff. Again, we're talking here just about purely idealist panpsychism.
Okay, right.
For someone like Goff and Strawson, they don't deny the fact there's a physical world. As I described it earlier, they think they can eat the cake and have it too. Now, I'm not ever sure, and I follow Goff on this, of thinking about what physical evidence, and this is the point we keep going back to, what physical evidence gives us reason to doubt the reality of consciousness. I think he says in the book, it's like thinking that astrology could give you a reason to doubt the existence of telescopes. You need telescopes to do astronomy. Astronomy. You're definitely not astrology. Yeah.
He would hate you for that.
I'll get another email.
Yeah.
You were telling the season moment, guys, that I like astrology. Like,
an astrologer. Here's Philip Goff is an astrologer. Breaking news.
I read my star sign for today. Philip Goff is just around the corner. Oh man. So doing astronomy with a telescope, I've got no reason to doubt telescopes. And I need consciousness to do science, and science doesn't give me a reason to doubt the apparatus which I use to go about and do the science. So there's that. I think that's where I'd settle on the defense of panpsychism. I don't see. Yeah, I think the evolutionary tale you just told as well is perhaps a compelling one. The illusionist obviously has a lot of questions to answer for the meta problem of consciousness as to why we say and think all the things that we do about consciousness. And there's a big research project to go on there. But yeah, they've got an opportunity to make progress with it, and that research should obviously be done. But I'm still not sure about what this. I think it's the start. Did we talk about the starting point earlier on? Again, whether or not you build from consciousness being unshakable and work outwards, or whether you start with the physical world. Is it I am, therefore I think, or I think, therefore I am? And I think you and I, Leon, in my Socratic defense of panpsychism, are going to disagree on that point. And I think we need to reconfigure our epistemologies if we're going to make any progress with it.
I hear you. That's fair. Okay, and then so one of the final questions.
What? You shying away, Leon? Come on.
No, I'm down. Listen, I thought there was a timer on this. Go ahead, please.
No, I'm only joking.
Okay, so one of the final questions before we wrap up. So I think both Alan and I would both obviously agree that we love this book, right? There's so much here, just in terms of like even the perspectives that like I or obviously Alan would disagree with. We get a lot out of them, right? So what would you say is, if we kind of look at this sort of subject broadly and we look at the book specifically, why do you think it would be important for somebody to think about these things, right? Because, maybe the person who works like the 9 to 5, who just, kind of is getting through the days wondering like, why should I care about consciousness? What does this do for me?
Yeah. Okay. A really good question, and one that's always important to come back to. The first chapter of the book, written by Gregory Miller, is why we should care about it at all. And I think that's always a good place to start with an issue like this, or as we are finishing up on it, right? The people who aren't interested in it have already tuned out. So this is
we'll make some
to the
edits.
choir.
No, I'm kidding.
Yeah. So you might think that it's just the only important thing is for the sake of itself, or understanding big theory of reality. And I think that's a good enough motivation for most people. But the book is obviously aimed at the general public, and I think it does have some important features to it. So in the myth of Sisyphus, Albert Camus asks us, well, he tells us that the most fundamental philosophical question is whether or not I should top myself or carry on living. And he obviously makes the latter decision, because then he continues on with his essay, and we're glad that he does, because it's a very good one at that. But you might think that there's an even more fundamental question, like within that question, is life worth living? Life, what is it to be alive? And conscious experience obviously plays a huge part in that. Like, what is it for you to be alive? What's the nature of your world? Are you the only conscious thing? What about your family members and loved ones? Is the outside world real? Like, these are, what about the non-human animals that end up on my dinner plate? Are they conscious creatures? Should they be considered morally valuable? David Chalmers in the third chapter talks about the distinction between what he calls Vulcans, i.e. creatures which are conscious but have no positive or negative conscious experiences. So they don't feel happiness, sadness. They have no pain or suffering. And he says it would be monstrous for not to consider these entities within as ethical subjects in their own right. So typically the animal rights movement, for example, think along with the utilitarians, that what matters is suffering, not whether they can talk or do podcasts and write books, but can they suffer? I think Bentham basically put it like that. And so the question of consciousness is, for the everyday person, what is the nature of your whole world, right? Because if you weren't conscious, then you wouldn't have a world. So for those who are interested, as so many of us are, about questions how we fit in with the universe, like, are we like the universe? Are we at home here? Should we be alienated from it? How should we be treating it? These are important questions that lie at the heart of, like, we spoke about our understanding of like God a few times here with Hinduism. Like, so many of people in the world are religious. Like, they care about this question. Like, if the world is one big global mind, they have to account for that within their theory of God. And that could have all sorts of implications. And as I mentioned, with moral value and stuff as well, like, we consider consciousness to be a valuable property. We typically think that it's worse to kill a conscious thing than it is to kill a non-conscious thing. We don't consider them on the same plane. So if you think about the question of consciousness, immediately your entire world may become more valuable when you think about the implications of some of these views. And I don't know, for anyone who's had think about Christians who have these conversion experiences and the whole world changes for them, or when we've all had those experiences in our life where we see the whole world through a new lens. And what a better way than to study the lens itself to give you some newfound love and appreciation of the world.
Wow.
Jack Symes, that was excellent, man. Wow, the time legit
fun.
Flew by. So excellent.
This is like literally one of my favorite podcasts.
Yeah,
I thought the Angus Fletcher was my favorite. I'm not sure anymore.
It's definitely tied.
Yeah.
All right, Alan, final questions for Jack before we wrap up.
So I did want to address the Adam Sandler thing.
Oh God,
I'm just joking. I'm joking.
Yeah, what's your beef with him, Jack? Huh?
No.
You the amount of people that have asked me that, I'm surprised that everybody is defending Adam Sandler all of a sudden. I don't think anyone. Okay, here's the thing with Adam Sandler. What it's made me realize is that either the zombie hypothesis is true and everyone's pretending to like Adam Sandler movies and they don't actually have them in the world of experiences, or it means they should buy the book because they haven't thought about their conscious experiences enough, and they would realize that it's not a positive one when they see his movies. Do you think, can you name any good movie that Adam Sandler's been in?
Billy Madison, one of my favorite. Well, it's not one of my favorites, maybe, but definitely one of my favorite comedies.
He's like, that's not quality.
I think I've seen that movie a million times.
How about this? Wait. I have one example. Maybe it's not the Diamond one or whatever that was dramatic. It was Click.
Click was a good one.
Click was quick. Oh no, he's like, no, I was liking these guys, and he's oh my god.
Click was a good one.
Click.
I'll say, all right, how about this? I'll say this one part. I got a little bit emotional when he was dying and his son was like, no, dad, and where'd the time go? And so maybe that part hit me emotionally. But I suppose if I really did rewatch the movie, maybe I'd be like, okay, this is a little lame here.
Stand your ground. You like Click.
Jack.
You like,
I like Jack.
Listen,
Maybe he's right.
I actually saw Big Daddy when it first came out. I thought Big Daddy was as far as the comedy goes, Big Daddy was exceptional, man. That whole thing of the kid calling him.
You were a child.
No, I just saw Big Daddy like 3 months ago.
Oh.
Yeah, I just rewatched it. I love that movie, especially when he calls himself Frankenstein. Come on, man. That's brilliant. It's brilliant. The kid calls himself Frankenstein, and they're like, yeah, you're Frankenstein now.
Yeah, I think it's a difference of there's lots of differences here. I thought we're getting along wonderfully, and I was about to say it's been a really nice time speaking to you both. But we've laughed and talked about some interesting ideas, and you seem like very reasonable people.
No.
Yeah,
I like this exchange anyway for the laughs, as far as that goes.
Yeah, and we'll get credit with Adam Sandler for defending him, so that's cool. All right, Alan. So final questions for Jack before we wrap up.
Yes. So if we wanted to follow your work, where could we find you?
I recommend, well, first of all, picking up a copy of
Perfect
Philosophers
timing.
on Consciousness.
Wow.
Go to talkingaboutphilosophy.com. It's the best book you will ever buy in your life, or your money back. Philosophers on Consciousness. That all money back only lasts for whatever the returns policy is as governed by your government. I think it's 14 days, something. Yeah, where else can you go? You can go to @the on Twitter, or follow us on Facebook, or listen to the Panpsycast, available on all major streaming platforms. I wouldn't follow me on social media. I'm
follow Adam Sandler instead.
and just in general, stop listening to Seize the Moment podcast.
That's what you get. That's what you get.
If you want,
I was telling you, don't poke the bear. What's going on with you?
If you want good movie journalism, then listen to the Panpsycast. If you want good philosophical discussions, then listen to Seize the Moment. The decision is yours.
Thank you.
I love that.
Thank you.
All right, Jack, thank you so much for coming on, man. This was excellent.
It's an absolute pleasure. I've really, really enjoyed it, guys. Thank you.
Absolutely. Talk to you soon, man.
All right. First of all, that was awesome.
Really fun. Yeah.
All right. So everybody, if you want to follow us, you can follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and at Seize_podcast on Twitter. Like, subscribe, hit the bell, and thank you so much for watching. See you next time.